And we have to fight for women's rights and participation. This is nothing that comes natural. This is not a default situation, but we need to be there all the time to remind, to push, and to fight to have this on the table.
Hello and welcome to this episode of She Stands for Peace, the podcast series that explores the state of the women, peace and security agenda in Africa through a series of dialogues with key actors. I am Dr. Yemisi Akimbobola, your host, and today I'm joined by Mr. Olsson Fridh, the Swedish State Secretary for International Development Cooperation. And the focus of this episode is financing peace. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Olsson Fridh. Would you like to start by telling us about yourself and your role as State Secretary for International Development Cooperation?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me in this series of conversations. It's a pleasure, and I think bringing attention to the agenda of women, peace and security, and maybe especially in Africa today, is a fantastic endeavor, so I'm really happy to be part of it. I am Olsson Fridh, State Secretary for International Development Cooperation in Sweden for the Swedish government. That means more or less that I am second in rank to the Minister for International Development and in charge of planning and making sure that the priorities of the minister and of our government is also implemented in the field of development cooperation. And as many who are involved in this field know, Sweden is committed to give 1% of our GNI to development cooperation. And we do that in a broad partnership to partner countries in a bilateral form, but also on the global stage, heavily involved in the multilateral cooperation and have a long history of being that also in the peace and development field, and especially as champions of women, peace and security agenda from its start.
Yes, and it's precisely of this history of Sweden's involvement in international development and your commitment of that 1%. That is why we need to have this conversation with you as exemplary in financing the women, peace and security agenda. So my question to you is, as a donor, how would you describe the current state of financing the women, peace and security agenda in Africa, particularly from that international development funding perspective?
Well, the short answer is that it's not enough, and therefore it needs our attention. And I think having the resolution 1325 on women, peace and security turning 20 or celebrating its 20th anniversary is also a fantastic opportunity for us to remind ourselves of the objectives of this agenda and maybe also reassure our commitment to it and some determination to continue to give it not only the enough financial commitment, but also political commitment, because still 20 years ahead, 7 out of 10 peace processes around the world still exclude women. But I mean, let me come back to it. Financing for peace building in general terms is a key challenge. And now we are also, witnessing the COVID-19 pandemic, and we see a lot of reprioritization of global financial flows and of financial aid to the health sector and to mitigate the socioeconomic effects of COVID-19. And unfortunately, I think that also means less focus on the peace processes, on peace building. So this is a challenge now, and it needs more volume, but we're not just talking about volumes here in terms of kroners or dollars or euros or what we are having, but we need to ensure that this funding is also increasingly coherent and adequate. And I think we need to recommit to how we act as donors to peace building. And Sweden is committed. We're launching an initiative that we also call Good Peace Building Donorship. And aside from our support in terms of financial resources, we also want to underscore the need of commitment in terms of improving quality of funding by ensuring cooperation and coherent approaches within and between donors, also the international financial institutions and so on, to foster more synergies in this area, because I think we can reach much higher if we work better together also on this agenda. And if you allow me, I think, yes, this resolution, this agenda is a great success in the terms that everyone, or not I'm sure there are exceptions. Most people are aware that this resolution exists. People who work in the field of peace building know that this resolution exists. It's more and more a factor. But as I said, still less than 25% of peace agreements include gender provisions, for example. Less than half of the UN member states have a national strategy for this implementation. So yes, we've had 20 years of doing improvements, but if we look back, if we look forward more, we see that we need to raise more awareness. We need to increase our joint understanding on the agenda. And as we have entered now what we in the UN, family often refer to as the decade of action, that decade of delivery, we need now to go to implementation, more true implementation of this agenda as well. And again, to come back to your question, we need more investments here. We need more financial resources, but we also need to start financing in a different way so that we can reach the objectives of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, as the intention was.
Yes, absolutely. And from what you've said, we can see that Sweden has a long tradition of generous and ambitious development cooperation. So, what are the key objectives for you as the government of Sweden and the key values that drive your support of the Women, Peace and Security agenda in Africa?
Well, you see, we are a feminist government and we pursue a feminist foreign policy. That means that we are committed to always to bring the resources, the representation, and the rights of women and girls to the table in every process, in every question that we work with. And that all goes, of course, also with peace building and development. And we know, for a fact that development is much more successful if girls and women are not only seen as victims of conflict, but seen as actors of conflict resolution. And the resolution came to place. It was an answer to generations of neglect of women as peacemakers, as negotiators, as mediators, and clearly put as equal actors on the political scene. And if you are a feminist government, you know that this is something that you need to fight for on an everyday basis. And I think this resolution is a great mean. It's there for us to work with and start implementing. And I think it serves our agenda, our feminist agenda, very well. And therefore also, comes very handy into our development policies and our financial or donor policies that we have.
Absolutely. And I really want us to unpack a bit more what you said there about Sweden being a feminist government, really to understand what does that mean and how has that feminist approach been applied to your foreign policy approaches in supporting the Women, Peace and Security agenda.
In accordance with what we call then the Sweden's feminist foreign policy, that means that we shall strive to strengthen all women and girls' rights, representation, and resources, the 3 R's in this package. And that's based on the reality, which is the 4th R, in which women and girls live. And this, of course, is different in different contexts, with different historical contexts and so on. Unpacking that could be like, acknowledging that in order to achieve this, we need at least 3 things. First, leadership. In order to achieve the full integration and keep momentum, bold and strong leadership is, of course, key. And we have to fight for women's rights and participation. This is nothing that comes natural. This is not a default situation, but we need to be there all the time to remind, to push, and to fight to have this on the table. And it's in this also extremely essential, to counter attacks on women's full and equal enjoyment of human rights, and maybe especially including sexual and reproductive health and rights, which is definitely under attack globally. So this type of leadership that we don't back down, and we have seen that this leadership has been successful in the sense that now more countries are coming along, launching their version of a feminist foreign policy. And the more countries that could come out with this type of language, I think it's easier for us also to continue to push for this type of leadership. Well, secondly, apart from the leadership, we of course need the implementation. This is not worth much if it stops at, nice words in resolutions or in different texts, but we need to be very practical. And these practical measures have to be taken by national governments and multilateral institutions, but also by individual missions. And we need to be concrete as possible. And the Women, Peace, Security agenda has to be included. This is an example, but has to be included where plans are designed, patrols are being sent out, trainings are being conducted, analysis are being created. When we move from words into implementation, that's when we need this agenda, and that's when we also need our feminist analysis or our feminist policy. Thirdly, to wrap this up, accountability, that we know from the start that we have clearly defined responsibilities that we can follow them up, and actors could be held accountable to them. That means, to continue. I mean, first of all, of course, to fully implement, but also to continuously communicate and follow up on the agenda, on these policies. And that is very essential. We need to make sure that, whatever is decided becomes reality for those concerned, and that we can hold people accountable for not doing that. And one key element of that is that we have put a lot of effort into is to have regularly consultations with civil society organizations, and then especially women's rights movements, for example, both at the local, and this is something that is a local level, and this is very much done by our embassies around the world, but also on a national level. I regularly meet Swedish civil society to discuss these matters with them, but also on an international level where Sweden have, I would say, a position where we regularly also consult and discuss these matters with the international federations, for example, that exists within civil society working for women's peace and security agenda, but also more generally the women's rights agenda.
Yes, and earlier on you mentioned that 1% of Sweden's gross national income is dedicated to international development cooperation budget and objectives. And we also have SIDA, the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, which is tasked with ensuring that integration of the conflict perspective and the gender equality perspective in all the development cooperation. So my question is, what lessons might you share as Sweden with other governments funding the women, peace and security agenda in Africa specifically?
And one conclusion that we've made from these last years and also monitoring our own work is that gender equality or women's rights or the women, peace and security agenda, when we discuss these matters, we need to see it both as an objective by itself, but we also need to see it as a mean to reach other objectives. So if you go about to only sort of streamline these perspectives into other areas and other objectives, you can reach just but so far. And if you just put it as an objective itself with very separate action points, you can as well just reach so far. But if you have these issues as an objective by itself, but you also make sure that you streamline it, then your ability to have success is much, much greater. So we are, for example, within our development cooperation, in all of our bilateral development strategies with partner countries, which is about 40 countries around the world, there's always gender equality as an objective by itself. But we're also very clear that all of the actions that we do need to be gender sensitive. And that type of logic can be translated also to the work with the women, peace and security agenda. We need to, in all of our sort of conflict resolution, all of our humanitarian work, we need to make sure that we have a feminist or a gender equality lens through everything. But we also need to have separate actions where this is the key objective. And together that forms quite a strong movement that makes the work in total more successful. That I think is one lesson. But we have some other general observations, and which either could make it easier or more complicated in the implementation. And one of that is that there is an uneven and selective application of the women, peace and security agenda. In some conflicts, it is included in a very high extent, and in others, it's almost invisible. And of course, again, here, referring back to my first observation, this needs to be high on the agenda by itself, but then it also needs to be something that is mainstreamed through the rest of the actions in that type of in the work in that specific conflict. Also, that local peace and security, the needs locally should be put in the forefront of the agenda when we put the resolutions into practice. And again, that this falls back into participation, that there is a true participation of women's movements, of women's groups, because if their needs locally, it's not the groundwork, then we miss out on a lot of things and we will miss out on success. And then, of course, the commitment needs to be real. sometimes women's issues, gender equality, sexual reproductive rights, and the women, peace and security agenda ends up as something that we talk about, but we miss out in the implementation. We need this commitment. That includes also the financing commitment. If we have a peace negotiation, if we have a peace deal which is financed very much with external resources, and we all earmark our contributions to that peace, and we miss out on this part, then of course it's not going to be successful. So again, coming back to very much a broad, unearmarked financing also helps this agenda forward.
So you speak there very clearly about the importance of partnership in the actual implementation of
Yeah.
the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So how do you assess the existing coordination between the different donors engaged in promoting Women, Peace and Security agenda in Africa?
Sweden's support to civil society and the independent work of women's organizations is central in promoting the objectives of the Swedish National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. And that is based very much on trust, on a long-term perspective. And it helps also to prevent what we see very often nowadays as, the shrinking space for civil society to work in conflict-prone contexts. So, and unfortunately, I would say we are increasingly and with I mean Sweden. Sweden is increasingly becoming the major or even the sole donor to organizations in the democracy, human rights field, women's rights field, due to its political sensitivity. That also applies, in this field or around women's rights organizations, unfortunately. We could call it maybe early lesson from this has been that the need for institutional support for women's rights organizations is important, and the need to broaden the actors who work actively with women, peace and security is also there. I would say that the existing coordination is sometimes good because the actors that you need to coordinate between are too few. But our work is also characterized by a long-term strategic support, and we hope to continue that. And the more actors that come into and wanting to work with this agenda, of course, coordination becomes even more important, more complex, but that would be a good thing.
Well, in view of that, then, what do you think it takes in order to ensure effective coordination among different actors to enhance implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda in Africa beyond where we are now, 20 years after UNSCR 1325?
I would say that there's definitely, to start with, the need for increased donor coordination in this field. Yes, of course. We could always reach further if we are more coherent, if we're more coordinated. In terms of dialogue, I think pressure and development assistance has been identified as important in order to achieve these results. There's a need to identify, like-minded donors, to talk with them early, coordinate on a very early stage. Very often, we find ourselves that Sweden is the only bilateral donor that raises these issues in various contexts. In many countries, Sweden is a driving force for gender equality in the different donor coordinating groups or vis-a-vis the government in the countries that we are partnering with. There is also a risk that the agenda for women, peace and security, that it will be donor driven instead of driven by local ownership. And this is, I think, a biggest challenge that we have to deal with. I mean, of course, we have a very strong political position here, but we cannot drive this above the heads of the women that are involved and who should lead and own this agenda. So we need to promote, for real, long-term capacity building that is necessary also to work ahead with the agenda. And sometimes I think, just coming to ease with the notion that the Women, Peace and Security agenda is not an add-on, nothing that you could add to the end because it sounds nice or this is something we can do when we have time left over from all of the other important stuff that we have to work with. This is very much core in not only in reaching that peace, negotiating that peace and reaching a peace agreement, but this is often the start of a state building process. So the start of a peace building process is an early start of a state building process. And the ones who are involved with the peace building process, that will also be the map from which you then navigate to do your state building. So to have women being equal partners in peace building, that of course makes it a lot, that the steps will be so much smaller to take then to also have women be an equal partner and actor in state building. And this is where we want to in the long run where we want to go. We want this to be a political process where gender equality in state building, in gender equality in the process around transitional justice that usually comes after a while and so on. So if we take this more long-term perspective, we can see that the women, peace and security agenda is not an add-on, nothing we can choose to do or not, but it is a very central part, because if we don't integrate it, if we don't succeed with it, then we will not succeed in the long run in terms of state building, making sure that women and girls' rights are on top in the to-come sort of state building process that will have to come later on.
Absolutely. And earlier, you mentioned the impact of the current state of the world with COVID-19 and the impact that it's having on a global scale, with the pandemic almost pushing the women, peace and security agenda to the back burner. And your foreign minister, Anne Lind, speaking at the 16th High-Level Forum on prioritizing the women, peace and security agenda in a time of pandemic, she said, "Where a crisis moves in, inclusion moves out." And she called on governments not to lose sight of the focus on advancing the agenda in the midst of the crisis. So to wrap up then, what advice would you offer other governments as they begin to allocate resources towards peace-building agendas at a time where perhaps international development budgets are so much more constrained than ever?
Let me start by referring to another very strong female leader, Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed. She said earlier last year that we have two choices now. We can lose the gains of past decades, or we can emerge more resilient, equal, and inclusive from where we are now. And to me, the answer is very simple. Yes, we live in a time with parallel, mutually reinforcing crisis, climate crisis, COVID-19 pandemic, a humanitarian situation that is extremely dire around the world, socioeconomic sort of collapse of value chains, growing inequalities. We have to choose to look upon all of this as a momentum, as an opportunity to build back better, to make sure that the future that we will give to our children is a more sustainable, equal, and gender equal world. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic has both revealed and worsened the economic and social inequalities, and it's prepared the ground for shrinking space, and it has relapsed into conflict affecting women and girls around the world. But it has also shown the urgency of moving forward from here. And I think what we need to do now, as we gather in the multilateral arena, in the global cooperation that we have in the development banks or in the UN systems and elsewhere, and we prepare plans for this sort of economic recovery and building back better agenda, just make sure that gender equality is an integral part of that women, peace and security is an integral part of those complex crises that we have to deal with. Although 20 years have passed now since the resolution was adopted, efforts to establish and support diplomacy and dialogue that includes women, they are needed more than ever right here and right now. Women are in the forefront of combating the COVID-19 pandemic. Women are very often the first victim of these armed conflicts that are just procrastinating, just growing in numbers, and they become longer and more difficult to solve. So the Women, Peace and Security agenda remains one of our foremost tools to take us out of this world of parallel crisis and into a better world. And this is a reminder. We don't have this resolution because we wanted the resolution. We have this resolution because we wanted a different world. And now is an opportunity to build that together. And the pandemic has revealed, as an old Danish fairy tale said, the emperor is naked. And we've seen this now. And I think somehow this resolution is a cloth that we need to pick up and say, if we really mean something, if we really want this better world, then this resolution is a key weapon in our arsenal that we need to start using. And that means more donations, more financial support to it, but it means also a renewed political commitment so that we make sure that this becomes a reality now. We now lay the ground for a new way of thinking of peace building, and then women's participation is a must. But we don't need to invent that. That idea is now 20 years old. It's becoming an independent adult, and we now need to let it be this actor that we want it to be in the international field.
Thank you very much, Mr. Power Olsson Fridh. I think that's a perfect note for us to end this episode. This has been She Stands for Peace, the podcast series that explores the state of women, peace, and security agenda in Africa. I am Dr. Yemisi Akimbobola, your host. Join me for the next episode where I speak with Madam Bineta Diop, the Special Envoy of the Chairperson of the African Union Commission on Women, Peace, and Security.